Persis Karim holds the Nida Nubari Endowed Chair and serves the director of the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State University. She is the editor of 3 anthologies of Iranian diaspora literature, as well as numerous articles on the subject. She is also a poet and lives in Berkeley, California. John Ghazvinian, 96, was born in Iran and raised in London and Los Angeles. He has a doctorate in history from Oxford University, and his writing has appeared in the Sunday Times, the New Statesman, Slate, and The Nation. He directs the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and he lives in Philadelphia. So one of the wonderful things, in spite of this year of restrictions, is that we can actually have programs like this where we reach out to our alums across the country. And so it's so wonderful to be able to bridge East and West Coast with us on a Brunonian platform. So before we formally talk about John's book tonight, I wanted to just engage with our guests and ask them a little bit about their trajectory from Iran to the United States. So especially with John, how his trajectory fed from Iran to Brown and his life after Brown. And so I'm going to pass it over to you, John, to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you. And thank you again very much for having me, Lisa, and thank you to Persis Karim for joining me. It's the first time we've met, and I've admired your work for a long time, and it's a pleasure to be in, looking forward rather to being in conversation with you after that. And I just want to thank the Brown Club for inviting me. I want to thank my good friend Emily Wages, class of '97, for suggesting this program. Although I don't see her on. Oh, there she is. I was just in the middle of thanking you for suggesting the program, and she shows up right on cue, making a great appearance. So thank you, Emily, for suggesting this to the Brown Club. And yeah, so my trajectory to Brown. Yeah, I was born in Iran. I was born in 1974. There's no hiding that, since you know what class I graduated from. I was 1 year old in 1975 when my family left. We moved to London, and I grew up on the outskirts of London. And then just a couple of years before high school, we moved to Los Angeles in the middle of the 1980s, and went to high school in LA, and somehow made no Iranian friends in LA. I'm probably the only person, Iranian or not Iranian, to have had no Iranian friends in Los Angeles. We had a very kind of assimilationist family who kind of, I guess just wanted me to fit in. So I failed to fit in, but I ended up going to Brown, like so many other people who failed to fit in various ways, and found a wonderful home there. Met some terrific friends, a couple of whom I see here on the call, Emily and my good friend Joe as well, who's just switched over to her advertising branding icon. So all of you should support EcoRI News as well if you're interested in the environment. And I'm glad also to see her dad, Cliff, here as well. So it's really nice to see you all here again. That's what led me to Brown, and yeah, here I am.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to Lisa for reaching out to me through my colleague, Michael David Lucas, who's a novelist and a creative writer in the creative writing program at San Francisco State. And I had just bought the book the week before Lisa contacted me. So I enthusiastically said, absolutely yes, even though I hadn't finished the book. I knew from seeing it that it was probably an impressive and formidable piece of research and writing. So I'm so glad to be with you all. My trajectory is slightly different. My father came to the United States in 1946. After Iran experienced the occupation by British and Soviet troops, and was rather, I think, ahead of his time in believing that Iran was never going to be free. And as a child, he read a book by Ali Dashti, who's a famous writer, thinker in Iran, who spent a year in the United States. And my father, at the age of 14, was absolutely persuaded that he had to go to America and experience for himself. And I'll just tell you one quick story that I think is sort of interesting, was that he told his aunt, and only told her, that he wanted to go to America, and he saved all his tumans over the course of 4 or 5 years, and eventually got a bus ticket and was going to go to Iran via Iraq. And his father found out about it and pulled him off the bus. And it was after the war where he was actually sent to the United States to study the American railroad system. And he decided to basically leave Iran behind and stay here. And so it was a bit of an accidental immigrant story, but not too dissimilar from John. It's this idea that diasporas are a series of expansions and contractions, and their movements in and out of places. So I think it's really wonderful that in some ways we're having these kinds of conversations that are long overdue about the ways that histories are impossible to impossibly affect people's actual lives in the decisions that they make, either deliberately or accidentally. So, and I ended up going to UT Austin to do a master's in Middle East Studies and then a PhD in comparative literature. And I was at San Jose State for 18 years. And then I had this amazing opportunity to apply for this position at San Francisco State for the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies, which is really an initiative to look at the movement of people and cultures out of Iran and into other locations. So John's work, I think, is so germane to the kinds of things that I think we need to be doing, which is to document a lot of these untold stories. So thank you. So I guess we'll just start, right? Okay, well, first of all, I'm a big fan of plugging people's books. So I encourage you to buy this book. It's well worth buying it in hardback. It's a pretty hefty book too, as you can see. I think that one of the things that we need to do in this moment is to absorb and devour everything we can about Iran, because there is so little. And one of the things you point to, John, is the ways in which people learned about a place through rather secondary sources, such as the Bible and travel narratives being another one. And I want to also just say one thing that I loved about reading your book is that in some ways you're really invested in cultural studies, not just history per se. The idea that how cultures come into contact with each other and generate narratives about each other is so important, especially about the Middle East. So I wondered if you could start by, I know that your book is broken into these sections, which are attuned with seasons: spring, summer, fall, and spring. But the first chapter in some ways is the newest material to most of us. Anybody who knows about Iran, of course, knows anything from World War II on, but you really document a much earlier period. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this early period and also talk about the concept of Persophilia, because I found it totally fascinating. And especially because there was also, on the cultural front, the Persophilia was connected to Iranian or Persian poets, right? So Emerson and some of the transcendentalists who were drawn to Iran as a cultural wellspring, as well as some of the things you identify. So if you talk a little bit about Persophilia and how that begins this relationship.
Sure, yeah, no, thanks. It's a great question and a really rich one that I could talk about for hours. In fact, what you're putting your finger on is actually a lot of the material that ended up getting cut out of the book. So the book was actually originally twice the length, exactly twice the length that it is now. And so you can thank my editors at Knopf for that. I can see you all like laughing. You know, you think it's funny now, but if you had to deal with twice the material that you have to go through, you probably wouldn't be on this call. A lot of that stuff got cut. The stuff about the transcendentalists, I had, you know, the literature, the Emerson, all that stuff. There were pages and pages about that. But you're right. I mean, you know, in many ways, this is a story of narratives as much as it is a story of interactions, right? It's a story of beliefs, fantasies, preconceived notions. This is why I wanted to take the book back as far as I did, because, I think a lot of people know a little bit about the history of US-Iran relations. And if they do, they'll know about some of the landmark events like the 1979 hostage crisis, the 1953 CIA-backed coup. But, I was really trying to say that there's so much more to this history than that. We tend to use those two events so often as like a weapon as like clubs to beat each other with, the kind of, you started it, you started it. And I think that it does a disservice to history. It does a disservice to Iran and to the United States. It does a disservice to us as human beings to sort of use history in that way. History is much richer than that. I think history can actually liberate us rather than imprison us. And I think for too long, history of US and Iran relations has imprisoned us in this kind of blame game, like everything else with US-Iran relations. So one of the really liberating things about taking the history this far back was to see just how long and how warm and how rich this history was. What a long history of mutual admiration and fascination, and even mutual idealization there was, and for so long. You used the word persophilia, which is interesting. That was a painful lesson to me and to anyone who's interested in writing a book or doing scholarship, which is that I came up with that phrase, and I thought I was really clever when I was talking about the 18th century, the love that colonial Americans had for Iran and kind of Persian things before they knew anything about Iran. And it took me 12 years to come out with this book. And in the process, Hamid Dabashi wrote a book called Persophilia. He didn't take the phrase from me, of course, totally independently, but it was an important lesson. Don't take too long to finish your work. But yeah, there was very, very early on, and this blew my mind. I mean, this was the last thing I expected when I started doing research on this. You don't go in thinking you're going to find this. I started looking at the earliest American newspapers published in Philadelphia and Boston in the 1720s. The very, very first newspapers published in America, just to see if there was any mention of Iran. Boy, I mean, I wasn't ready for what I found. I mean, they were obsessed with Iran. 25, 30% of the newspapers every week talking about Iran. I came across a newspaper published in Philadelphia in 1723, I think it was, that said, the lead story was, "We regret that we have no news about Persia this week." That was front page news in America in 1723. The fact that there is no news from Iran this week. That was the headline story. And we could spend a lot of time talking about that. But long story short, they were consumed with this idea that Iran was the lesser of two evils in the Muslim world. The Ottoman Empire was the great evil empire of its day. I mean, you forget in the 1720s, this is only 40 years after the Ottomans were at the gates of Vienna, right? If you are a white Christian English settler in North America, you see yourself as British, you see yourself as European and part of European Christendom. And so the big threat of the day are the evil Turks, the Ottomans. And so there was some awareness that the Persians were the great rivals of the Ottomans, and therefore, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But there were also biblical reasons why they idealized the Iranians. Persia in the Bible comes out really well. Cyrus liberating the Jews from the Babylonian captivity in Ezra chapter 1. The three wise men from the east, the three magi. People forget magi is plural of magus, which is a Zoroastrian priest. So these are the three wise men, are probably Iranians. This is how Persia comes out in the Bible, whereas the Ottomans, who of course don't exist yet, are seen as being the heirs to the throne of Babylon, to everything that is evil. There's a lot of this stuff, right? So Iran is this, Persia, as they call it, is this kind of idealized, exotic Eastern kingdom that is just to the east of everything that they're afraid of. My opening chapter is called East of Eden, because these were Puritans, and they believed very literally in the Bible. And they believed that the Ottomans were in control of the holy sites of Jerusalem. You guys all study the Crusades in school. There was a long history there. But the easternmost site of the Bible was the Garden of Eden, and they believed that was somewhere around Mosul in present-day Iraq. And they believed that the Persian Empire began just to the east of Eden. It was idyllic in every way. It was harmless in every way, historically, politically, religiously, militarily. It was this kind of fairy tale land. And why am I going on about this so much? Because I wouldn't, if it weren't for the fact that I see this staying in the American psyche when Americans think about Iran. I mean, this is the way they thought about Persia before they knew anything about it, before anyone had been there, before they had come into contact with Iranians. But that mentality remains all the way through, I believe, all the way through to 1979 in a lot of ways. You know, I was recently looking at this documentary that Orson Welles narrated called Flame of Persia, about the 1979 2500-year celebration of the Iranian monarchy at Persepolis. And it could have been made in the 18th century. It was this, you know, this dramatic, you know, mise en scène about the sort of this, you know, idealized, you know, kind of harm, you know, but a non-threatening kind of, you know, exotic Oriental kingdom. And this is in the 1970s when Americans saw the Middle East. What did they think of? A lot of really bad things. They thought about, but mostly associated with the Arab world. They thought about the Arab oil embargo, socialism, you know, third worldism, wars with Israel, you know, these kinds of things they didn't like. But just to the east of all that was this pro-American king, this glamorous, you know, kind of exotic Oriental kingdom. You see that throughout the history. You see it with the very first American who shows up to live, who moves to Iran to live in Iran, Justin Perkins in 1834, the Protestant missionary shows up to establish a Protestant mission in Iran. The word he uses the first time he lays eyes on Iran is Edenic, right? Edenic. Literally, it's like, I mean, the Garden of Eden. It's a sort of paradise. That, you know, that stays with us all the way through. So it's a long-winded answer to your question about Persophilia, but yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the movement from Persophilia, which is sort of the 18th century, and then 19th century, when your book talks about the desire on the part of Iran and Iranian statesmen and monarchs to basically develop a closer relationship with Iran in the age of British imperialism, right? Where the great force in the world are the major imperial powers, Russia and Britain. And in some ways that shift begins to happen towards the United States in a much less cultural way and much more pragmatically and politically. Exactly.
And in fact, so this is, I mean, exactly. So if this is the Iranian version of East of Eden, this is sort of West of Eden, if you want to call it that. If Americans looked at Iran as a less evil, less threatening version of the Muslim world, Iranians looked at America initially as a less evil, less imperialistic, less threatening version of Europe. Remember that in the 19th century, Iranians considered the US a European country. I mean, this is the way they saw it. It was basically populated and led by Europeans. That's how they would have seen it. But unlike the other European countries, as they would have thought of it, unlike Britain and Russia especially, the US seemed to have a very different approach. It seemed to not be as imperialistic. It seemed to have come to power in a revolution against the British Empire. It seemed to have a very hands-off foreign policy. It didn't seem to want to interfere in the affairs of weaker countries halfway around the world. This was appealing. In the 19th century, Iran was being pressured very badly by Russia and by Britain, who neither of which ever formally colonized or annexed Iran, but informally pulled the strings behind the scenes more and more and more over the course of the 19th century, economically, politically, and in a lot of other ways. And you know, the kind of growing movement of Iranian nationalists, if you want to call them that, over the course of the late 19th century, really were enamored of the US. They wanted to cultivate a third force, a sort of third alliance that would that they could sort of use as a counterforce to the British and the Russians. And they turned to the US. Why? Because the US was the one, you know, they saw Americans in their backyards building schools and clinics. They saw American Presbyterians in Iran. But weirdly, the US government didn't seem to want to get involved. And that made the US so much more appealing. And so this is why they initially first thought of the US. But the interesting thing about this is, right, the very first disagreement that Iran and the US had was in the 1850s. Right away, as soon as they came into political contact with each other, they had a disagreement. And it was over the creation of the first Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation that the two countries signed in 1856. It took 5 years to negotiate that treaty. It took longer to negotiate that than the JCPOA, than the nuclear deal. Why? What would be so complicated? What would be the cause of this kind of, like, you know, complex disagreement between Iran and the US in the 1850s, right? Well, there were a lot of sticking points. But the one that really stuck with me, the one that I find really interesting, right, was that because Iran wanted to send a message to Britain and Russia, they wanted to invite the US to get more involved in their affairs. They actually wanted to buy American warships, put them, man them with American troops, and fly the stars and stripes from Iranian shipping in the Persian Gulf, right, to send a message to the British. I mean, it's crazy. So the US, obviously, no entangling alliances. We don't want to get involved. No way. We don't want any part of this. That's the first disagreement. That's where it all began, with Iran wanting the US more involved in its affairs, and Iran and the US saying, no, we don't want to get, that's your country. We don't want to get involved and tell you what to do. We don't want to get mixed up in your business. I mean, as a historian, that's pretty incredible to me, like how we got from there to here. It's literally, right, 180.
I wonder if, if you could comment a little bit, because it's so interesting. Shortly after that, the US does become an imperial power, right? In the Pacific, the war over the Spanish-American War, and the sort of acquisition of new territories. Is there any perception on the part of Iran that the United States is, a new player in this big game?
That's a great question. It's interesting. Weirdly, no. Yeah, yes and no. I mean, there is some, but what's really striking to me is how throughout the early 20th century, as Iranian newspapers begin to cover the US much more as a rising power and so on, just how the tone with which they cover the US, when the US does things they like, they're very admiring, oh, we need to learn from them, we need to emulate, the progress, the first form of government, the free press, all these things that they like. When the US does things that seem a bit imperialistic or, perhaps less attractive, there's a tone of sadness and disappointment and almost disbelief. This can't really be, this doesn't register, it doesn't make sense. The US is not behaving in accordance with its own principles. There's, you even see, this is true as late as the early 1950s, which is incredible if you know the history, because this is 2 years before the CIA overthrows Iran's most popular, beloved prime minister. The newspapers, I mean, I read some of the newspapers, the nationalist newspapers that were pro-Mossadegh, they were deeply supportive of him, right? Bakhtar Emruz especially, very pro-Mossadegh newspaper. In 1951, 52, when they're starting to get irritated with the US for various things, the tone is incredible. They say things like, the US clearly doesn't have enough, maybe they don't have enough experience in world affairs yet. They haven't tasted the bitter fruit of world leadership. Maybe they're being misled by the British, but it doesn't fit with what we know of the US. It's like there's this cognitive dissonance. They don't want to believe it. Even Mossadegh himself in the 1940s, when he's in parliament and he's arguing with Arthur Millspaugh, the hated American financial advisor that no one in Iran likes. He's up there in the parliament. He's saying, and you look at his speeches, they're incredible. He said, I'm sure that Americans are good people. I'm sure they wouldn't want one of their own to behave this way. There's a lot of that kind of language. So different from the way they talk about the British. Right up until, it's striking to be in the summer of 1952, right? 1 year before the CIA overthrew Mossadegh. When you have communists and nationalists fighting, ripping each other's posters down on the walls of Tehran, getting into fistfights, news reaches Tehran that Samuel Jordan has died. Samuel Jordan was a Pennsylvania Presbyterian who for 40 years was the principal of the Al-Bor School, formerly the American College of Tehran, a beloved figure. The whole city comes to a standstill for his funeral, right? In 1952, a year before, right, the coup. 3 weeks before the coup, when Iran is being starved by sanctions and embargoes by the British, and he's not able to run the government, and he's desperate for money, he writes a letter to Eisenhower because he thinks that the US is the last refuge that he has. He thinks that Eisenhower will understand his plight, and he asks for money. And the letter arrives in the White House just after Eisenhower's already made the decision to give the go-ahead to Operation Ajax, the coup that's going to overthrow Mossadegh. And he gets a very kind of canned response. But he says, we can't really help you, whatever. But right up until the end, Mossadegh believes that America is the country that will understand what Iran is dealing with. So that idea, and maybe it's an idea, but so, even in the face of reality, even when, US is occupying the Philippines or whatever, there isn't, anti-Americanism doesn't really exist in Iran until after 1953.
Yeah.
And even then, it's limited more to sort of liberals and nationalists, not the political elite.
I wonder if you could say anything about the relationship between how people viewed the United States and the the figures who were key in the constitutional revolution. Did the American version of a constitutional system affect what was going on inside of Iran at the turn of the century?
I'm so glad you asked me about that, actually, because when we talk about the Iranian Revolution, everyone thinks of 1979, but we forget that Iran has had two revolutions in the 20th century. First revolution was the constitutional revolution, or the Mashruteh, of 1906 to 1909, which was a sort of popular uprising against absolute autocracy, about absolute monarchy and autocracy, and in favor of a constitution and a parliament, the first in Asia, the first in the Muslim world. It's interesting. I looked at some of the constitutionalist newspapers of the 1890s that, in the decade or so leading up to the revolution, including the one Tarbiyat, which was edited by Muhammad Ali Furughi. This didn't make it into the book, but I was really struck by, just how much he and that newspaper praised Benjamin Franklin and the founding fathers of the US and so on. I mean, this was part of the milieu, right? It wasn't. There's this assumption that the inspiration was, French or what have you, but actually, it was international. It was happening in many parts of the world around the same time, including Japan and the Ottoman Empire as well in the first decade of the 20th century. But the great story about the constitutional revolution, there are many great stories that involve the US. A lot of people like to talk about Howard Baskerville, and I can talk about that if you want, but I actually think the more interesting story is Morgan Schuster. So after the constitutional revolution, actually it failed initially, and it precipitated a civil war because the Shah, the king, was being supported by the Russians and cracked down on the constitutionalists. And eventually the constitutionalists came out on top. And in 1911, they requested, the parliament requested a financial advisor from the US. They were brimming with pro-American sentiment. All the constitutionalist newspapers, they said, if there's one country that knows how to do things, it's America. If there's one country that does things with integrity, it's America. Let's get an American financial advisor into the US to help us sort out our finances and corruption and all these kinds of things. So they send this request, and the US sends over the guy by the name of Morgan Schuster, a 34-year-old American lawyer, who immediately arrives and is so smitten with the constitutionalist cause that he becomes much more than just a financial advisor. First of all, the parliament makes him treasurer general of Persia, putting him in charge of the entire finance ministry, basically. But he then goes even further than that, and he starts doing battle with the Russians on points of principle. He only lasts 6 months until the Russians eventually invade and shut down the parliament and kick Schuster out of Iran. But as he's on his way out of Iran, his motor car is, the route is lined by people waving American flags and cheering for Schuster. The parliament sends a special urgent cable to the US Congress begging for help in the very last minute. They make the mistake of writing the cable in French. So no one in Congress understands it, and they sort of laugh it off, they shrug it off. But it's a very poignant moment, actually. They say, you who have tasted the fruits of liberty, would you deny help to us, to those of us who want nothing more than to emulate your form of government, right? And it doesn't go anywhere. But Schuster comes back. Now, the interesting is Schuster also comes back to the US and becomes a celebrity because his escapades have been covered by the press while he's been over there. It's this kind of, American savior kind of thing, whatever. It's not without its problems, the narrative. But, the fact is that it reminds me a lot of the cable TV coverage of the Arab Spring 10 years ago. I think people were very taken by it in the US. It was very similar in 1911. Almost actually exactly 100 years earlier, there was this kind of moment where Americans were just enamored of this kind of Iranian constitutional cause, this moment of national self-determination, and this American who was leading the battle for them and so on. And when Schuster came back to the US, I mean, there was a stampede just down the street here on Walnut Street in Philadelphia, people trying to go out to hear him speak. He became a national celebrity. He wrote a best-selling book, blasting British and Russian imperialism. And this is an incredible moment, because I think if there was ever the highest moment, the high point of US-Iran relations, it's around here, right before the First World War, where Iranians for the first time look at Americans as people who are, you know, on their side, and Americans look at Iranians as this kind of heroic nation struggling against European imperialism. They kind of fall in love with each other. And I think there's even this cultural moment, you know, you see it in the fashions right before the First World War, you know, kind of Persian fashion becomes all the rage at kind of debutante balls. You know, you have kind of films and books, and Omar Khayyam becomes, and the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam becomes popular for the first time in the US, like really popular. I even think it's not a coincidence that in 1912, when the US Post Office chisels its motto across the central post office building in New York, they choose that famous motto: "In neither rain nor sleet nor gloom nor whatever it is, no snow nor gloom of night shall stay these couriers from the swift completion of their dutiful whatever appointed rounds." That's a quote from Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, praising the Persian Empire for its incredibly efficient postal system. You know, I think there's a moment there, right?
That's wonderful. Thank you. And that kind of leads us to this very critical moment where oil, which I know you know a lot about because you've written a book also about oil in Africa, where oil kind of changes everything, right? Up until then, there's a more sort of benevolent rapport and narrative, and then oil in the 20th century, and also around the context of the rise of fascism in Europe, kind of cements Iran's place in this very complex game. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit, for those who don't know, some of how oil changes the relationship between Iran and the US, and also, of course, Britain.
Yeah, people will disagree with me about this, but I actually don't think oil changes the relationship. I think the Cold War changes the relationship. I actually think the story of oil in US-Iran relations is actually, it's really interesting and not as simplistic as people I think often see it as. I think actually the really interesting story about oil and US-Iran relations takes place in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, when there's this kind of quiet rivalry between the US and the British for Iranian oil. But actually the 1953 coup, and I look, people will disagree about this, historians disagree about this. My personal feeling is it wasn't about oil, it was about communism. You know, basically, you know, but the short version, of course, is that Mossadegh, very popular prime minister that I mentioned earlier, nationalizes the Iranian oil industry, which until then had been, for 50 years, had been in the hands of the British. And it's a very, very, very popular move among the Iranian public, but of course causes a massive 2-year-long crisis with Britain, very similar to the Suez crisis that comes a couple of years later with Egypt. You know, similar kinds of principles at stake, really. It's about, you know, sort of third worldist nationalism, self-determination, and the Cold War. The British are doing everything they can to try to undermine and destabilize Mossadegh and get rid of him. Mossadegh eventually figures this out, and he breaks off ties with the United Kingdom, so it becomes impossible kicks all the Brits out, closes down the embassy. So it's impossible for them to do anything, so they turn to the CIA and the incoming Eisenhower administration, which is, as many of you will know, the first Republican administration in 20 years. They've been out of power for a long time. They come to power on this wave of anti-communist fervor in the United States. And that is what the British use to kind of get their way. They convince the incoming administration, especially the incoming Secretary of State and the incoming director of the CIA, John Foster Dulles and his brother, the Dulles brothers, who are fire-breathing anti-communists and are very much convinced by Britain's narrative that Mossadegh is potentially dangerous, that he's destabilizing the country, that Iran is not ready for democracy, that Soviets are going to take advantage, and he's flirting with communism, all of which is just complete rubbish. And the State Department knows that. But they get overruled, and the CIA gives its backing to this coup that overthrows Mossadegh in August of 1953.
Right. I wonder if people want to ask questions. I'm gonna encourage you to start posting them. Otherwise, I'll keep asking John some questions. But I encourage you to engage and take it wherever you feel you want to go with it. And some of you may or may not have read the book, but it's a long history, and so there are many details. And I also think you have so many wonderful anecdotes about some of these interactions, human interactions between people. I was last night looking at some of the photos, like the World's Fair, and how these moments, these sort of cultural moments or moments of interaction, become sort of larger moments to either change things or cement things or continue to create those narratives that we started talking about at the beginning. And I wonder if there's anything that you want to share with the audience that you think is a particularly indicative moment of that kind of exchange on a personal level.
I mean, there are so many. You put me on the spot. So you mean sort of indicative of what?
Indicative of some of these either misfiring connections, or that they kind of help culturally to cement some of these beliefs that are mostly manufactured anyway, based on fantasy and conjecture.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great moment right after the First World War. Iran is neutral in the First World War. Its neutrality is not respected by the belligerent powers. The Ottoman Empire, the Russians, the Germans, the French, the British, everyone crisscrosses Iran to fight one another. Iran ends up suffering quite badly in the First World War. It's a famine, 2 million people die. And it requests a seat at the table at Versailles at the peace conference after the First World War. And the British veto that. And the US is actually quite irritated by this, because the Wilson administration feels that this is exactly the kind of attitude that belongs to a previous era, a kind of imperialistic attitude, that Iran belongs at the table as well, even if it wasn't officially a belligerent in the war. And there's a whole bunch of back and forth going on. And then, unbeknownst to anyone, the British do a secret deal with the Shah and some of his government ministers to the so-called Anglo-Persian agreement, that where basically they say, oh, we'll represent your interests at Versailles. We'll make sure you get everything you want. We'll make sure you get the money you want. But we will basically turn Iran into a kind of protectorate. They don't use that word because it's very loaded, but they basically say, we want advisors at every level, at every government ministry, British advisors. When the population hears about this, I mean, there's incredible outrage in 1918 when the news of this emerges, including in the US and including in Britain as well, public opinion in Britain. But the US actually decides to make a real stand for Iran. Not in a huge way, but in a rhetorical way. They actually, the American ambassador in Iran writes a letter to the newspapers making it clear that we didn't know about this. We didn't know what Britain was doing. And then, he's instructed to do that by the State Department. But then he goes rogue and he actually decides to print out dittos of this, kind of copies of this statement, and have them distributed by the thousands all over Tehran. And Iran breaks out into pro-American demonstrations for the first and last time in its history. The markets are shut down. Iranians flee to the US embassy seeking refuge against their own government. I mean, it's an incredible moment. So I'll use that one.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your archival work, because I know that you did very thorough work in both Iran and the US, and probably a little bit in Britain as well. What was your access like in the archives in Iran? I read in the acknowledgements that you went through great pains to get access to them, but were you limited by what you could view and read and actually copy? And if so, why?
Yeah, that's a huge question. In fact, I'm working on an essay now. I'm going to write about this because it's a much longer topic that I want to write about properly. But yes, it was very important to me that I knew that people had written this history before, history of US-Iran relations. They would write it again. One thing I wanted to do that hadn't been done was to use both American and Iranian sources, because I think one of the things that I've noticed as soon as I started doing the book, the weakness of this is that American historians who only use American sources because they only have access to it. Iranian, it's the same thing. They're not able to come here. that already begins to just perpetuate the division between the countries, even before anyone's, even in the way the historians are approaching it. But the interesting thing is the American historians who have written the story only with US sources typically start the story around 1940. And it makes sense why, because if you only look at American archives, if you only look at American sources, the very clear story that emerges is that story doesn't matter before 1940, that the US is an isolationist power. It's not in Iran, might as well be Antarctica. They don't care. There's no strategic interest there. Well, that's fine, but I think that's what message are we sending when we say that the history of US-Iran relations only becomes important when the US becomes interested, right? The fact is that for 90 years before, from the 1850s until the 1940s, Iran is very interested in getting the US more involved in its affairs, as I said earlier, right? That's their very first disagreement. But it doesn't just stop in the 1850s. Every single Iranian government from the 1850s to the 1940s wants to develop the US as a closer strategic partner, as a counterforce to Britain and Russia. That is a really important part of the story. And we miss that when we only look at US archives, because the US archives make it seem like nothing's really happened. But when you look at the Iranian archives, it's a totally different story. It's a strategic part of their foreign policy, right? So I really wanted to, yes, look at Iranian archives. I went to Iran 3 times. I didn't just want to look at archives in the traditional sense, but also, travel around the country and visit places that were things like, and if we had more time, I would show you pictures like the American Presbyterian Cemetery, which is in the middle of nowhere in Iran, where you have graves of over 50 Protestant missionaries who are buried in the 19th century. The first, the church, the Presbyterian churches that Americans built that are still being used by Presbyterian Iranians, small numbers that were converted 150 years ago. Those are also archives to me. But I spent a lot of time in the National Archives and also the Foreign Ministry Archives. Very, very briefly, I'll just say, yeah, it was very difficult. Iran has this law that every government ministry has to deposit its archives at the Central National Archives. But the Foreign Ministry and I believe also the Defense Ministry are actually exempt from that law because their archives are considered too sensitive. So the Foreign Ministry has its own archive, which is really, really hard to get access to. And I went there day after day after day and just annoyed the hell out of them until they gave me some kind of access. And even then it was pretty limited. So I only got to, it was just, reasons are complicated. It's not actually particularly political. It was more logistical. They just, they were going through some changes in terms of the way they cataloged and archived some of their materials. But I managed to get up through about the 1920s. So more recent material I never actually got to look at. But even just that early material, I think really fundamentally changed the kind of book I ended up writing. And I think that's important. And I'm glad I was able to do that.
So they didn't limit you to a particular time period? Like, could you do research on more contemporary period in the Iranian archives? Like, if you wanted to? It's
a tough question to answer because it's like a lot of things, right, with Iran. It's like not entirely clear, and it kind of depends on when and what the what the atmosphere is like and what So I know people who have gone, when. So I think. Let's see. I mean, the short answer is I personally chose to take a cautious approach, and instead of going in and saying I'm doing history of U.S.-Iran relations and set off all kinds of alarm bells, I just said I'm working on kind of 19th century and early 20th century Iranian foreign relations with the Western powers. They did want to know a little bit more, and I gave a little bit more information. But as I went in and I finally got access and became friendly with the staff, and we would have tea and biscuits every afternoon and whatever, and they would just bring me whatever I wanted. And I think I probably could have looked at more contemporary stuff, but honestly, time ran out, and I was kind of working chronologically. And then the next time I went back, it was actually during the Iranian election crisis, and there was a whole new staff and a whole new system, and so I had to kind of start again. And then there was that disputed election in 2009, and I was there for that, and I was actually leaving the country with hundreds of archives on a memory stick, which could have ended badly. But and I haven't been back since, partly because A, I felt like I had enough material. B, the political atmosphere changed. It became much more tense after that. C, just my own life, circumstances, a lot of other stuff going on. I just wasn't able to kind of get there. And then also D, honestly, the book was so long. As I was writing it, I'm like 400, 500 pages in and I'm still in 1920. And I'm like, okay, I don't need to go to Iran and get more material. I need to work with what I have. So one day, inshallah, I'll go back and be able to get a little bit more.
Right. There's a couple questions, and I'm going to start with the one that's more specific, which is from the Brown Club of Greater San Francisco. How do you think Iran would have evolved if Operation Ajax had never happened? That big question that many people like to postulate.
Sure. And by the way, I don't know, it's a small enough room. I actually feel like, I see people have their cameras on and whatever.
Okay, sure.
From now on, let's just do questions. I think it'd be nice. Okay. I think you don't want to just. I think people might be getting tired of just hearing my voice. So let's.
Okay, perfect.
I think that would be nice.
If you could just make your questions somewhat brief, and try not to repeat if it's already been answered. How about that?
So the question about whether historians are always very uncomfortable with counterfactual questions, but. It's a great question. I don't, I don't know what Mossadegh would have been like with more time in power, or whether he would have stayed in power. What would have, I would like to believe that Iran. Look, I think the great insight that Mossadegh had, the great piece of advice he had for the Shah was you reign rather than rule, right? Let your prime ministers rule while you reign. Become a constitutional monarch. Will go down in history, like all other constitutional monarchs. Start to cede power. Start to create a democracy. That was advice that the Shah was not prepared to take. He was obsessed with military hardware, with becoming a military strongman. I don't know, what would have happened if there had been a power struggle between the two. I mean, Mossadegh was a true royalist. He didn't want to betray the Shah. I mean, I believe that. So, and he did resign at one point. When they had a disagreement about the military. So what I've seen of the Shah ever since is that every single prime minister, no matter who they were and what their political ideology, they didn't last very long, because at the end of the day, he didn't really want to share power fully over the things that he felt were really important, which were foreign policy and defense policy. So I don't know. I mean, JFK tried to push him in the direction of reform. And there's so many ifs and buts and variables that I think it's just hard to know what would have happened.
I'm gonna sort of smash together two questions and sort of ask the question that I think you've probably been asked multiple times already, which is like, what do we do with this history, and how can we use it to better either inform, say, the American public, and also perhaps improve the relationship between the two countries? And that's sort of a combination of Emily's and Sedi Ann's questions. What do we do with this very important history that you've provided us, and how can it possibly affect the relationship moving forward between the US and Iran? Or can it? Does it have any bearing?
Sure. I'll even answer another question that I think probably inevitably I'll get, which is what's happening next with Biden and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I think that, look, as a historian, obviously, I don't like to give policy prescriptions. I don't think that, I'm more comfortable in the past than in the future, and I think that there are some very competent people in the Biden administration, I'm sure, who are much smarter than I am when it comes to this stuff. My contribution would be to say what I said at the beginning, which is that let's look at the first disagreement the two countries ever had. Let's maybe absorb something of its spirit. Obviously, it's not 1850. I don't think that somehow we're going to go back to a time when, Iran wants to bring the U.S. the U.S. to be its best friend, or the U.S. is going to kind of leave Iran alone, or anything. But I think we can absorb something of that spirit. I think that Iran today struggles in the same way that it did with Britain and Russia. In some ways, it struggles with Saudi Arabia and Israel. And there would be no greater rabbit for Iran to pull out of its hat than an American alliance that it could wave in their faces. No one expects that. It's the last thing anybody expects. But it's what they were trying to do with Britain and Russia when they were, in the 1850s. No one expects the U.S. to suddenly say that we completely respect the sovereignty of Iran and we don't care what, about its form of government. It's up to, we don't get involved in their affairs and so on. But what if it did? No one expects that. But that, how different would that be? Now, I'm not naive. I don't think these things are going to happen overnight. I don't think that suddenly Iran is going to somehow say, I don't think tomorrow we're going to wake up and find that, Joe Biden and the Ayatollah are having a summit meeting somewhere. I mean, these things are probably with us for a while. But that's kind of my advice as a historian. Is to look at the broader history and see that it doesn't need to be this way, actually. Yeah.
Carolyn, do you have a question?
Yeah, right. I'm wondering if you could make some comment about what is it. I'm tired of reading about malign Iran. I mean, it's so, what we get in the press is so limited. What should Americans understand we're missing about the current Islamic Republic? I mean, that would help perhaps round out the picture.
No, I mean, that's a great question. A lot. I think the number one thing, the biggest misconception that we have in the United States, and people get upset when I say this, they don't like it, but hear me carefully, right? The Islamic Republic is not a house of cards that's about to collapse. You may not like it, but that's not the point, right? I have no special affection for the Islamic Republic, okay? But that's not the point. You have to deal with reality as it is and not as you want it to be. The narrative in the U.S. foreign policy establishment for 42 years, since the day the Iranian Revolution took place, has been that it's an aberration, it's a house of cards, it won't last, the Iranians will come to their senses, it's going to collapse any minute. Within just enough pressure, the people will rise up against their hated leaders, and that's just simply not the reality. And that doesn't mean you have to like the Islamic Republic. It just means you have to recognize, even if you're approaching this from the straightforward perspective of national security and wanting to defeat Iran, you cannot craft a winning strategy, a successful strategy, even if your strategy is to get your enemy to capitulate and all that, which is not the way I look at things. But if that's the way you want to look at things in Washington, it's not going to be successful if you build it on a foundation that, frankly, I think is a house of cards, a foundation that is incorrect, which believes that fundamentally you have this population that is just waiting to rise up and have another revolution against its leaders. That's simply not the case. And there are many reasons why that's not the case, which I'm happy to talk about. But I think you've got to start with that. The debate in Washington right now is so, the discourse about Iran is incredibly impoverished. This is what it looks like. On the Republican side, it is maximum pressure and regime change. It's if you just pressure this, the goal is regime change. The goal is to collapse the regime and to replace it with something pro-American. If you put enough pressure on it, and somehow that'll happen. It's not going to work. The Democratic Party's foreign policy is containment. If you just use a sophisticated enough toolbox, range of tools, and enough kind of sophisticated multilateral diplomacy with your allies and so on, and make Iran into the problem and isolate it, and you'll contain it, and therefore you'll win somehow. Neither of those really works, and I think it's an incredibly unimaginative way to approach the problem, because neither side actually talks about real, serious, sincere diplomacy that actually brings the entire range of interests and disputes that both countries have and legitimate concerns that both countries have onto the table for a serious and good faith dialogue. That's actually never really been done, except maybe once when it actually worked, when it led to the nuclear deal.
Can I ask you on this note of capitulation about sanctions, if you could talk a little bit about sanctions as part of this whole picture?
Sure. I mean,
well, I think that the perception is that if we just maximum pressure, meaning sanctions, we can sanction the, out of Iran, and hopefully create a collapse. It doesn't appear that it's working. And I wonder what your take is on sanctions as part of that tool of maximum pressure.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly ineffective. I actually don't think that. So yeah, I think that particularly under Trump, the goal of sanctions was very visibly, to undermine and completely collapse the republic if possible. The Democrats, though, I mean, Obama used, plenty of sanctions as well, though for a totally different reason. In many ways, he was pressured into doing that by the Israelis. But I think that actually for the Obama administration, the sanctions, it was about weakening and isolating Iran. It wasn't about, it was about just, strengthening the U.S. position vis-a-vis Iran. Whatever the case, whatever the point, it's ineffective and it's frankly immoral and inhumane. I mean, the Iran is subject to a level of sanctions that are far, far in excess of anything that's ever been inflicted on a country in peacetime. I don't think most Americans are aware, even remotely aware of how severe these sanctions are, how much they've affected the day-to-day lives of 80 million people and the diaspora as well. Although much more important, we're fine for the most part, but people in Iran are really suffering, pretty severely from this in a way that just is not going to achieve anything, and it's just not right. That's how I feel about sanctions.
John, I have a question.
Cliff has a question, yes.
So I'm only 100 and some odd pages into the book, so maybe you answer it later on in the book. But I noticed in the revolutions in the 19th century and early 20th century, the religious class, religious leaders, the mullahs and ayatollahs, played sort of a peripheral role. They were supporting the changes, but they were not leading it. And yet suddenly in 1979, we get to the point where they're the whole story. They're creating the change. How did that evolve?
So I don't know exactly what page you're on, but I don't know if you've got to the Constitutional Revolution yet.
Yes.
Okay, so you see there,
they were involved, but they weren't the leading.
They are, they're a pretty important, they play a pretty important role. They're not, leading, it's a kind of coalition of clerics, intellectuals, bazaar merchants, but I don't know that the Constitutional Revolution would necessarily succeeded without them. They played a pretty pivotal role. Mm-hmm. Not all of them. Some of them were opposed to it. Some of them were more traditional. Some of them, but that's the first time they play a really major role. Although they play, So I think this will be answered a little bit when you get a bit deeper into the book. But I think the short answer is actually throughout history, up until that point, the Iranian clergy, or ulama, to use a more accurate term, played a sort of what's often described as sort of quietist role in politics, which is to say that they supported the kind of political infrastructure. They were very similar to the clergy in a lot of Catholic European countries, in sort of earlier periods in history. Didn't rock the boat, didn't get too involved in politics, basically supported the idea of authority and traditional kingship and those kinds of things. What you're going to see, though, I think what you're getting at is later in the 20th century, the clerics, there's a division between the more traditional quietist ayatollahs and a new generation of radicals who are more opposed to the government. That comes about because the next dynasty that you haven't got to yet, the Pahlavi dynasty that comes into power in the 1920s. So that's the dynasty for the last two Shahs, the Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah. They rock the boat. So basically, up until then, the kings of Iran, the Shahs of Iran had understood, it was a kind of a mutual understanding. The clerics supported the powers that be, and the powers that be allowed the clerics to have their privileges. Again, just as it had been the case in Europe, their land, their sources of income, things like that, their powers over courts and justice and family courts and things like that. There's a full frontal assault on that from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and even more so under the second Pahlavi king, the last Shah of Iran. And they take more and more of the privileges away from the clergy. And that's when they start to become much more rebellious. And Ayatollah Khomeini is the first really well-known, sort of iconic Ayatollah that breaks away from that traditional quietist mold and says, you know what, monarchy is not even Islamic. This idea that one man should have more power than other people, Islam doesn't have any kings. This is a pagan ritual. This has nothing to do with Islam. People should be equal, because Islam, of course, preaches the equality of Muslims, et cetera, et cetera. And starts to become much more vocal in his opposition to monarchy, his opposition to Western imperialism, to the United States, to all kinds of policies of the Pahlavi state. So that's a sort of short answer to that.
John, this is Nader. Sounds like you've been able to collect a good set of valuable and scarce documents. Even maybe copy them on a memory stick. Are these documents available for others, for other researchers?
It's a great question. Not something I've thought about too much. I may make them available. It's a little bit tricky because, I did mention the memory stick earlier. I only have about 100 documents on a memory stick. Everything else is actually scribbled by hand. So I don't exactly have things in a form that is actually really readily available. They're notes like researchers would take anywhere else. But yeah, I'm not opposed to making those available if that makes sense. But it's like I said, mostly they exist in note form. So
thanks.
Sure.
Laura or Lara, do you have a question? She's not there. I was wondering if you thought this book will find its way to Iran, either formally or informally. It's a big book to translate, but as we know, things do find their way either in underground or, and do you think that it would provide something for the Iranian people or the Iranian leadership that might be revelatory in their eyes?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, something I'm only just beginning to look into. As you know, Persis, it's very difficult with books that are published outside Iran being translated into Iran. Iran is not a signatory to the Copyright Convention, which means that anyone can actually kind of do a kind of bootleg translation and publish it in Iran. And I hope to be able to work with a more formal publisher, translator if I can, maybe outside Iran, and then look to. But then the problem is, importing books into. This is what we were talking about. Because of the sanctions, it's simply impossible to sell books into Iran. And I don't want the money. I don't care about that. But it's the publisher is going to have something to say about that. And if you have a translator, you want to pay a translator. It's not. It's so difficult. And there are so many challenges. And then, of course, there are censorship issues as well. There is a Ministry of Irshad, of guidance, Islamic guidance, and that does sometimes publish, sometimes get rid of passages, and I am not comfortable with that. So there are a lot of there are a lot of challenges. But I welcome anyone's advice on this. But I've been approached by a lot of translators who say they want to do it, but I need to look into it a little bit more. I know a lot of people in Iran have been able to read the book. My publisher wouldn't like my saying this, but there are actually websites where you can download it illegally, bootleg copies. There's Russian hackers have set up something called LibGen, that I understand Iranians have been using to download, copies of the book in English at least, to read it. And I have no problem with them doing that. I want people in Iran to read it, and if that's the only way they're going to be able to, then they should.
Any other questions? Nader, is that a hand still up or? Okay. Well, I don't know if there's one last call. Do people have any comments, questions? I have a question as a scholar. What's your next project? This was you must be resting, and obviously giving birth to a book takes a long time because you want to see it walk in the world. But it seems to me it's a book that has multiple audiences, both in a university setting, in a historical setting, but it's got a lot of energy around the idea of how places are informed by long-standing perceptions. And in a sort of ironic way, you start the book with Persophilia, And we're living in the time of the opposite of Persophilia. I don't know what you would call it, some kind of repulsion of all things Iranian. And it's so different from where you start the book that it's hard to imagine something coming afterwards. But it's sort of my hope that the book has that kind of a ripple effect, you know, that it has some kind of way in which it speaks to people about the idea that we have to sort of understand that history is not cemented. You know, it's a little bit like, I was thinking about, this is a long courtship. It takes a long time for them to realize their marriage. It's an unhappy marriage. And then they finally get divorced and they're still getting divorced, you know, and it's a rancorous divorce, right? We want there to be like the kids grow up and they get to have, you know, Christmas holidays or Nowruz together as the former enemies of the past. And I just wonder if there's any way in which you think this book can be used to create that kind of a conversation. I mean, book clubs are great, but any other ideas?
Yeah. So I think there are probably two questions there, right? Which is, so in terms of the next book, I'll be honest with you, this book was very taxing in a lot of ways, but it was also a project I worked on during some very difficult times in my life, and it was in many cases the one thing I sort of still had to hold on to. So it's been a very long and difficult and emotionally challenging number of years that's taken me to sort of to this point. So yes, I do want a bit of a break from writing. I also am very, very busy. I have a full-time job that I really love and that keeps me very busy at Penn. So I'm not jumping into another book project right away. But probably the next one would be, there's a huge amount of material from the early period that got cut out, sort of, you know, that's sitting on the cutting room floor, that I think is amazing. You know, people, I think, instinctively believe that the interesting stuff is the more recent stuff, but actually I disagree. I think the really interesting stuff is the early stuff. And there's so much more of it than I was able to put into the book in the end. And I'm thinking about writing a book, something along the lines, you know, because I think there's this feeling a lot of us grew up with it. We were Iranian or Iranian American, whatever, that everything was fine until 1953, until the CIA overthrew it, which is not untrue. But I think that there's this feeling of, well, what do you really mean by that? You know, when you say everything was great until, was there really a golden age of US-Iran relations before 1953? If so, what did that even look like? Most people don't really know much about that. So I think I might want to write a book that's sort of, you know, the world that was lost, right? The US and Iran before 1953, that really tells that story properly in the way that I kind of wanted to originally, you know, because there are hundreds of pages of that got cut. So I may do something like that as a next project. But in terms of your other question, which was about what, you know, I forget how you phrased it very nicely in terms of, I guess, yeah, from Persophilia to kind of Iranophobia, as
Oh yeah,
the great Israeli scholar Ram Haggai, you know, refers to it. You know, I did break the book down into these 4 seasons, and I think that ended up being a formulation that makes a lot of sense to me. Because, not to get overly poetic about it, but you have, you know, you start in the spring, you have summer, autumn, winter, but what comes after winter, right? As another spring. And that's what I really am hopeful for. And that's why I put as the epigraph to the book, I use this verse from Hafez, which those of you who are fans of Persian poetry, I hope would appreciate, which is In tatavul ke kashid az gham hijran bulbul tat sara parde gul na'd zanan khahad shud, which is, you know, I think I translated it as after the lingering sorrow of separation lifts, the nightingale will tear back into the rose garden, its throat filled with song, which is to me a great image of spring and what spring should be about and what should follow this very long, dark winter of hatred that we've had. And that is kind of what I'm hopeful for.
Thank you. I think Emily, or do you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, I just wanted to ask John if you're aware, has the book made its way into American foreign policy circles? You know, if you have any sense of how this book has been received, or if it's gotten that sort of attention? Thank you.
Not that I know of. I see no signs that it has, sort of that way. I don't know. I wouldn't say I haven't received any calls from anyone who's in a position yet. I mean, obviously it's been, I've done interviews and it's been reviewed, in sort of DC centric sort of policy publications and, podcasts and things like that. But it's, Robert Malley hasn't been on the phone to me or anything like that. So, I'm sure they just, lost my phone number or something.
Carolyn, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I do. I wanted to thank you very much for writing this book. It gives the perspective from Iran's view, and also kind of fills in a lot of information that I certainly didn't. I've lived in Iran for several years. I've been back briefly as a tourist more recently, and it frustrates me that there's so little understanding really of both the history and the culture. I would hope that we can get some more readers. I'm a member of Peace Corps Iran Association, and we'll certainly be plugging this in our group and friends and so forth. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
And thank you, if I may, thank you for your service in the Peace Corps and for playing a role that in the history of these two countries that, in retrospect, was something we could have used a lot more of. And I'm really, I've been contacted a lot by former Peace Corps volunteers, including, obviously, I know John Limbert quite well, but others have been in touch recently. I think they want me to speak to their annual reunion at some point. So I forget the name.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I think,
It will blow your mind, John, because there are all these people who spent their formidable years in Iran and like Persophilia in the 20th century, except they, it wasn't all fantasy, right? So I thank you too, Carolyn, for coming. I'm so glad you made it. The other thing I wanted to say is I hope that some of the, universities that do serve military and diplomatic kind of audiences will get a chance to read it, and I was thinking about Vali Nasr at Johns Hopkins, because in some ways I think it's a moment when we're so hungry for a different story. And I think that it's beautifully written, by the way, too. So thank you for that.
I appreciate that. I don't want to end on a negative note, but I'm not actually hugely optimistic that it will be. I met Vali Nasr a few years ago, and I have a lot of respect for his scholarship. But he kind of gave me the standard line about the 1953 coup, which has become fashionable recently, which is, why don't we talk more about Iranian agency? Which it sounds really good to progressive, to kind of white progressive American ears, right? But what does that really mean? So actually it was really an Iranian, coup. The Americans had nothing to do with it. Well, I would respectfully disagree, and I just think that there's a certain kind of narrative industry almost around Iran policy making in Washington that isn't going to take kindly to some of the interpretive, look, I tried really hard to be as impartial as I could in this book, but we all know that history is not impartial, and we're not able to just sort of hide behind the authorial voice of the historian. People are going to, take you to task for that, and that's fine. New York Times review of the book did exactly that by a historian that I respect and that I think has done a lot of good, interesting, and important work, but with whom I also fundamentally disagree. So but is someone who I think gets listened to much more. So there's a tendency. I think we know what the tendency on the right looks like in the U.S., but I think there's often a tendency on I won't get too political, but the so-called left in the US, and sort of the Democratic Party, there's a tendency to go, oh, well, we need to hear more Iranian voices. But the only Iranian voices they want to hear are the ones that tell them what they already believe. And I think that's, that's fine. But
Yeah. Yeah, it's an echo chamber for sure, both in the media and the the policy wonks. So I think it is hard to break through. And I think it's also there's a lot of investment. And you pointed out there are lots of agents who are invested in seeing this narrative continue, states and individuals and entities. So I think it's right to be realistic. But let's be hopeful anyway. So anybody else want to ask any questions? I just want to make sure that if you had something you wanted to say, we have a few more minutes. Okay. Well, thank you so much, John. And we really appreciate the labor of love that you put into this. And I wish you great success with the book. And I'm going to definitely recommend it to many people, and I hope you all will too. And for younger people, I think it's an opportunity that we've never had the opportunity to share this kind of story with younger people. So I think it's a really wonderful contribution. So thank you very much. And thank you to Lisa Ryers and to the Brown University community who made this possible. I think it's so important to celebrate the victories and accomplishments of our peers. So thank you again.
thank you, Persis, for doing this. It's a privilege to be in conversation with you, as I said before. Thank you, Lisa, very much for organizing this. Thank you again, Emily, for suggesting this. Thank you, Joe, for coming. And thank you, everyone else, for coming as well.
Right.
Applause all around. Thank you so much, John and Persis, for donating your time. Thank you, Brown community and Friends of Brown, for spending a little more time in the virtual world at the end of the day. We really so appreciate it, that we continue to try and maintain our intellectual curiosity that we fostered at Brown, and continue to try and keep looking globally when we're continually under this restrictive environment. And thank you so much, John, for writing a book that allows us to do that and reminds us to do that. Thank you so much. And just one more plug for our club. This is something that we do once a month with a different alumni author every month. So next month, we'll have Sunisa Manning, class of 07, and she'll be talking about her book, A Good True Thai. So we'll be going to Thailand, and we'll be talking about the student protest movement in the 1980s in Thailand. So we'll continue our global reach, and I hope perhaps you can join us in March or April or sometime in the future. And wishing everyone well. And Persis got her first vaccination shot today, so we're hoping Persis continues to feel well. And thank you, everyone, for coming.